Welcome to the F4 podcast, where your hosts, Brian, Brooke, Charles, and Vanessa, discuss all things faith, family, friends, and fitness. What is F4? Sometimes it's a glimpse into how we navigate the world, and sometimes it's a deep dive into how we handle the four main areas of our lives. If you want to have a healthier relationship with God, family, friends, and yourself, this podcast is for you. Thank you for joining us as we unpack this episode.
Welcome to episode number 26 of the F4 podcast. I am Brian Marston, one of the F4 hosts. We want to thank you for listening and watching our podcast. We invite you to follow us on Instagram and to like and share the podcast if it is beneficial to you, which it will be. We are on a plethora of platforms, including Apple, Spotify, Google, Pocket, Radio Public, Breaker, Anchor, and YouTube. And some of these probably have merged by this point, but you get the idea. If you would like to be a sponsor of the show, you can message us on Instagram, Facebook, or via email at f4ncpodcast@gmail.com. I'm joined today by all of our F4 people. My other half, Brooke, and our fabulous friends, Charles and Vanessa Giddens. Jazz hands. Today, we're going to return to a subject that we explored 20 episodes ago. Oh, that's a long time ago. Does anyone remember what we talked about in episode 6? Of course you do. It was the Under Pressure podcast episode where we discussed the internal and external pressures that lead to anxiety. And it was inspired by the author Steve Cuss. I love that name so much. But much of the material that we will use today will influence what we talk about. That didn't make any sense, but you know what I mean. And it was gleaned from Mr. Cuss and can be further explored in his new book, The Expectation Gap, the tiny vast space between our beliefs and experience of God. In his book, he helps us answer the following question, and I absolutely love this question. How to be less annoying and better at managing annoying people, specifically in relation to anxiety management. Now, do you know any annoying people? Do you? You probably do. The reality is, anxiety is something we have to manage and can be defined as a feeling of fear, dread, apprehension, tension, or uneasiness. The unfortunate truth is that if we don't manage our anxiety well, it will manage us. The good news is we can all grow in our anxiety management by becoming self-aware of the 4 spaces of anxiety and by exploring them in detail. This is what we're going to do together today on the podcast. Are you up for digging beneath the surface? Great! I knew you would be.
I don't know what's happening.
We'll begin with space number 1, the space inside of you. The space inside of you is the anxiety that is bubbling underneath the surface of our lives or your lives. And we are not always conscious of it, but it is there. So how do we discover the anxiety inside of you and me specifically? We do this by bringing our assumptions, expectations, pressures, and triggers into the light. The following questions, which we're going to discuss together, will help us in the discovery process. If you're listening or watching, think about how you would answer these questions as we process them out loud. So you ready? You ready? You ready? You ready?
I'm not sure.
Oh, you're ready. So my first question for you, Brooke, is what triggers anxiety in you?
In preparation, as we were talking about this, you and I, what triggers me, I think most often, is being rushed. If someone is actively rushing me or I feel rushed, especially into making a decision, that tends to trigger anxiety in me.
Do you have a good I took a sip of water, and that was almost resulted in something very bad. Do you have a good example of being rushed? And
Well, just yesterday, I was working with my daughter to register for classes for college, and there had been kind of a snafu with some of the online registration pieces and things like that, and so we'd already had a trip in person to navigate some of that, and everything that was supposed to be fixed wasn't necessarily fixed, and so you get online and you start trying to go through the process. Of course, she was expecting that it was going to be really easy because all of that was taken care of when we met, and then we started going through the process, and it wasn't quite as easy as she had expected, or I had expected for that matter. But then I was like, okay, hey, let's slow down. Let's look at these. Let's look at our options. Here were the things that they told us. Let's look through these things. And it was like, let's just try. And just all the clicking, and the computer, the website is slow. So there's like that spinning wheel of death. And it's kind of like, okay, let's just wait. And I think I did a pretty good job of not getting completely sucked into the anxiety that was happening, but at the same time I was really having to fight becoming anxious because I couldn't say, I didn't know the answer. I needed a little more time to explore it. I needed time to be able to think it was okay if it took 10 minutes instead of 5. There was nowhere, there was no we didn't, we had places to be later, but no, we didn't have to be somewhere in 5 minutes, and if we did, probably wasn't the best time to be trying to tackle that project anyway. So it's, for me, that would be an example of feeling rushed, especially into making a decision, trying to figure something out, and it, I could feel my shoulders, rising up, and that tension.
Like your traps and neck were becoming one.
Yeah. I was losing my neck in the process.
I think that's a great example, and I actually overheard some of that. So you did handle yourself really well, because she had this anxiety inside of her that is seemingly driven by her expectations that it was going to be easy. That's a really good example. How about you, Vanessa? What triggers anxiety in you?
3 things came to mind for me. 2 of which are pretty much the same. Dogs or children that are running amok makes me nuts. And also other people's expectations of my time management can trigger, so similar to what you were saying, but yeah, that can trigger me a little bit.
So do you have any good examples of that are a little more specific?
Well, okay, dogs running amok. This isn't really running amok, but we have 3 dogs that I can think of in this neighborhood that make me crazy. And they make me crazy because they are allowed to do the things that make me crazy. There's one dog who I bet is very sweet, and the owner walks this dog on a harness, and it doesn't matter if it's a person on foot, if it's somebody in a car, if it's somebody on a bicycle, it does not matter. Anytime something approaches this dog, it stands up on its hind legs and barks like a fool and basically pulls the owner around. And the other 2 are walked by the same guy. And bless him, he walks his dogs while he's looking at his phone. And the dogs, anytime another dog passes, at least it's limited to other dogs, but when another dog passes, they are both at the end of the lead, yapping their fool heads off, and he continues to stare at his phone. So there's some good examples there, and I have some prime examples that happen at the gym of children who are not aware. They're children, and they're not aware of their surroundings. So that makes me anxious.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, first of all, I was thinking about with the dogs, it would be a great opportunity for you to carry around some business cards and to hand them to the owners and saying, hey, I know this dog training business, Altius dog training. Anyway, the second example.
You don't have to have your picture on the business card. Just hand on the business card.
Just have a picture of Demas. But the second one, when you talked about the kids, that's something I've seen firsthand, and really it's a safety issue. Mm-hmm. And I think you guys, and I'll say you guys because you've been managing a lot of that, are doing a good job in figuring out how to keep the kids safe, but also not hating their time there, because we have a lot of moms that come to the 9:30 class, and to be able to provide an opportunity for them to work out while still bringing their children, I think is a really strong benefit. Yeah. So you guys are doing a great job working together, and I know because all three of you coach that class, making that happen. But I can understand the anxiety, because like it would be an absolute nightmare to drop a weight on a kid. Like just to even think about that. And from a liability standpoint, that's, I mean, not to mention you don't want to hurt anybody, especially a child, but then the liability on top of that is just like,
90% of them are well behaved, but even the best of them occasionally will run through to ask a question or to go to the bathroom at the last second, and and they're little, they're just not aware. Mm-hmm. So
Yep. That's good. Thank you for sharing those examples. How about you, Charles? What triggers you? Nothing. Okay, let's move on. Next question.
I'm not triggered at all.
I'm going to give you an opportunity. What triggers anxiety in you?
I wrote a bunch down. I know this is a shock. A feeling of abandonment, lack of loyalty after someone says there's going to be loyalty. Thinking someone else will have a better seat in our relationships. Seeing people who want something or say they want it without being willing to put in effort to accomplish it. Pretending to be something or someone you aren't.
Do you have any good examples that you'd be willing to share?
I think in general, I'm not going to get specific because in general, dealing with in the gym world, in the church world, just in general, nutrition world, it's all kind of the same, right? People say they want to do things, say they want results, say they are really in, right? And when things get difficult, as they will get difficult in life, no matter what you're trying to do, when you're trying to accomplish something, there's always going to be something that comes up, right? And I see it over and over again where people aren't willing to actually get past that and say, I'm really going to do what I said I was going to do, and I'm going to do it because it's important to me. I think that is, like, when I see that and people are like, oh, I want to get, like, I'll give you an example. Like, I just want to I want to lose weight. That's just an easy example. Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you willing to stop eating Sour Patch Kids? Well, no, I'm not willing to do that, but I'll do everything else. Or I'm not going to give up alcohol because, why would I do that? I just want to lose weight, and that doesn't have anything to do with it. So I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. Like, well, you really don't want to lose weight then. Really, at the end of the day, that's just kind of comes down to it. Or, a church example, I really want to get better. I want my walk with God to get better. Well, hey, you need to get up, 15, 20 minutes early and read your Bible. Oh, no, I'm not willing to do that. I'm really tired. You see, my life, my life is really busy, right? So that kind of stuff, without giving any really specific examples, that kind of stuff is, and again, I have issues in my own life. It's not like I'm immune from that. It's not like I don't say I want to do something and I make excuses for why I don't do it, because I do it too. I think we all can. We have the propensity anyway to do that. It's just one of those things. I see it. I happen to see it in the world that we live in a little bit more than I guess normally would show up. Mm-hmm. So it's just one of those things that's kind of like, from a relationship standpoint, I think I've talked about this. I know you guys have heard this story, but when I was a kid, I had a best friend, and we had another friend, end up being another really good friend, and he's a really good friend. They're all these people are still friends now, but I was a best friend, whatever, when you're, 6 years old, 7 years old, you got best friends. Like, oh, it's my best friend. And we had somebody new move into the neighborhood, and all of a sudden I wasn't the best friend anymore. And it really did a number on me. It's, even now, I'm 50 years old. I think I'm still fighting through that situation and how it made me feel and what that kind of pushed and triggered in me. So when I see things now happen, I immediately revert, and it may not have anything to do with that, but I immediately go back to that feeling of being 6 years old, 7 years old, and feeling like I got left behind. So, yeah.
It's interesting how childhood wounds don't just go away. It's important to be able to know what they are and then to process them, which we'll talk about some more today. Yay. So what types
You
of
didn't answer what triggers you.
Yeah.
Well, I would say there's a lot that can if I'm not walking in the Spirit. And what I mean by walking in the Spirit is that I'm attuned to God's presence in my life and submitting that to Him, surrendering to the leadership of His Spirit. But I think one of the things that really gets me is unreliability. When someone has said, I'm going to do something or I'm going to show up, and I really believe them, and then they don't, it can create levels of anxiety. Like if we all agree to meet somewhere at a certain time to get something done, and then certain people aren't there at that particular time, and I'm not saying like 5 minutes late, I'm talking like 45 minutes late. And
Or they don't show up at all.
Or they don't show up at all. And it's a time-sensitive deal, and you've counted on that person to show up for you. That can trigger anxiety in me. I think not getting what I want can sometimes trigger anxiety in me. Like if I have certain expectations of how things are going to be and they're not that way, and I really do have to adjust it. And if I'm not mindful about it, anxiety can spring up, and I don't even realize it's happening until later most of the time. So yeah, I would say those are a couple things. Those are not all the things that can trigger anxiety in me, but there are a couple. Yeah. So I'm going to move on to the next question. When we're talking about the space inside of us, what types of people irritate you? And if you're watching or if you're listening, think about this question. What types of people irritate you? I think that's a fun one to answer. So I'm going to start with you this time, Charles.
Wow. All right, how long do we have?
You
sorry.
have
All the people.
Do we have all the people trigger me and irritate me?
3 minutes.
Yeah, so it's funny you said what you just said. The second thing on here, people who don't do what they say they're going to do. It bothers me a lot. I think my father instilled in me a long time ago that if you say you're going to do something, whether you want to do it or not, it doesn't really matter. If you say you're going to do it, you need to follow through and you need to do it. And some people weren't raised that way. I understand that. And some people have the best of intentions to do something. But then when push comes to shove, something gets in the way of that, whether it be a time commitment, a scheduling snafu that you had, whatever the case may be. I think there are things get in the way of that. So that's the first one. People whose actions and words don't line up with who they say they're going to be who they are. And again, we can all do that. Like I can. There are times that I say something's important, and we were talking about something earlier that I kind of let go a couple weeks ago that I said was important, and I'm not doing it right now. So people could look at me and go, "Oh, you said that was important, but you're not doing it." So we all have that capacity, but I think in general, people that consistently do that over and over again to say, "Oh, I really want to do this," but you don't. And then the last thing is just non-authentic people. I struggle with people who I think are fake. And I'm not trying to judge anybody, but when you're like, that's not like you. The things coming out of your mouth they don't line up with who I see you are. Why are you laughing?
I do not think that word means what you,
You
think it means.
Yeah. So that those kind of people kind of, and I'm working through that. I think I'm getting better at that, but if I'm not careful, I can get very put off by that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
How about you, Vanessa?
People who don't manage their children and their dogs.
I see a theme. Dogs and children.
And one-uppers.
Oh, yeah.
And I do think, full disclosure, I think I used to be this way a little bit. And I think as I've gotten older and become a little more self-aware, I tend to refrain from that type of conversation. But yeah, one-uppers. And inauthentic people as well for me, but...
Yeah. Do you have a good example of a one-upper, like what you're talking about? You
Probably
definitely
not,
do.
Probably not any I should talk about, actually. Yeah.
So
She said, yeah.
so let's say you're sharing something that was exciting to you, and you are halfway through it, and the person you're sharing with you interrupts you, and they start talking about the exciting time they had.
Yes. It's that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a trip, or it could be an experience in the gym. It could be, I don't know, it could be a life, a big life thing, like an engagement or a wedding or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, people who interject into your story that you're trying to tell, to tell you all about their fantastic experience. And it's like, could you wait 5 minutes? Or 5 years? I don't know.
I'm not trying to be a one-upper.
Yes.
My favorite story of this is not my story. It's my aunt's story.
It's definitely one-upping.
She watched that movie 8 Seconds about that bull rider, whatever his name
Lane
is.
Frost.
Yes, thank you. I knew it was Frost. I just couldn't remember his first name. And she was talking about how great this movie was. And the person she was talking to about this movie said, "Oh, I was there. I was there when that happened. And let me just tell you," completely hijacked. And I mean, there is a difference between seeing a movie and actually being there when it happens. But she just was like, "Oh, okay, I guess my story's finished." So, now everything else I have to say is completely unimportant. So when I think about one-uppers, that's, to me, my favorite story that just pops into my head of, "Oh, I was there. Let me just tell you how great that was," or how traumatic it was, or whatever. So
That's pretty funny.
yeah.
I like that movie.
So I completely one-upped you on.
No, I love it. I mean, I didn't have a good example in the moment, but not one that I feel like I should share.
It doesn't out anybody that,
Right.
That's great. So how about you, Brooke? What type of people irritate you?
Or like irritate to the point of causing anxiety, for sure, I think, is anybody who is, we kind of summed it up the other day, like mean people, like that whole mean people suck. But people who are just unnecessarily harsh, like everything always has to be this, cut and dry, and we're going to just cut everybody off, and it's just going to be this way, and there's no wiggle room for anybody else's opinions or any of that kind of stuff. Like, people that are like that make me feel anxious inside, and it's annoying to me. And we'll get to it in a little bit, because these are some of my issues, but it all kind of fits together. But people like that. Not that one-uppers don't irritate me, people who don't do what they say they're going to do. All of that's irritating for different reasons. When you're counting on somebody to do something and they don't follow through. And I don't know. I feel like, maybe this is pity party, but I feel like that happens to me a good bit, that people say they're going to do something to help me and then they don't. And I'm left holding a bag and holding a whole lot of responsibility that I didn't necessarily want to take on. It's kind of the story of my life, it seems like sometimes. So maybe that's my want moment. So hopefully I'm done with that. So those things are definitely, I share some of that with you guys, but something that's different. People who are unnecessarily harsh or rude or abrasive or just not gentle and soft with the people around them.
Yeah. Yeah, I can totally see that. And I agree with you. Like, everything that's been shared so far can be irritating. I've thought through some of the things that they've shared and you've shared, Brooke. But I also am preaching tomorrow, and one of the truths that just pops right out because it's spelled out very plainly is do everything without complaining or arguing. And one of the things that can begin to trigger anxiety in me or irritate me about being around people is when they incessantly complain or are argumentative. And I say that, like, I've been guilty of doing that myself, like looking back on my life. So I'm not speaking about this like I've not been irritating myself. Sometimes I've looked back on myself and I'm going, you are so irritating, Brian. But when someone is perpetually or often grumbling and complaining about the circumstances, as opposed to trying to look for solutions of how can we make this better, how can we manage this tension or solve this problem, it is Brian repellent. Like, if they don't move past that, it's like, psh, psh, Brian gone. Because I can't sit in that too long, or I find myself just feeling completely like my soul has been sucked out of me. And one story I'm going to talk about tomorrow was the lady we took to camp years ago. And she had not served with our youth ministry previously, so we had no prior experience. And then we took her on a road trip with 200 plus individuals to Panama City Beach, Florida.
Which sometimes you do what you got to do,
Yeah, I mean, you need a lot of leaders, adult leaders, to do that. And so we did that. And she, up front, looked the part. She like, yes, I love what we're doing. The expectations were laid out for her. But almost from the very get-go, there was a complaint that then it was just like, it's too cold on the bus. It's too hot outside. Not to mention it's 90 degrees in the summer when you're going to Panama City Beach, Florida. The hotel rooms are not clean. The food isn't really all that good. Oh, it's too cold in the retreat center. Oh, the schedule is like too chaotic, and the kids are so loud, and I'm so tired. And it was just like a perpetual spinning wheel of these same complaints. And I had to have a couple interventions with her. And then on the back end, we met again, and we both were able to come to the conclusion that youth ministry was not the best place for her. But I don't know that any ministry would have been a good place for her, because she was a soul sucker. And if I were to award a trophy for the most
the superlative
for biggest complainer I've ever met in my entire life, she still is number one. So
we're now going to rename this podcast Soul Sucker. I think that's a great name.
Well, and like we're going back to the beginning, how to be less annoying. So if that's you,
you already know.
No, you probably don't know, because you would stop if you knew, if you really knew, or maybe you just don't care. But now I'm starting to complain. So, all right, so we're going to move on. The next question I have is, what assumptions do you have about yourself that you feel like you can't live up to? What assumptions do you have about yourself that you feel you can't live up to? And I'm going to start with Vanessa this time.
I don't know if you guys are like me and were told as little kids, you can do whatever you put your mind to. Yeah, that unfortunately stuck with me a little too much, I think.
Yeah. God, don't tell your kids that.
And I have a tendency to think that I can do whatever I put my mind to, and that's not always the case. especially when there are time constraints around whatever I'm putting my mind to, which is what leads to the anxiety of meeting others' expectations of my time management when it's something I'm putting my mind to. So, yeah, that's the big one for me.
I love it. There's so much unspoken in that, but I'm not going to prod right now. Brooke, how would you answer this question? What assumptions do you have about yourself that you feel like you cannot live up to?
So an expectation I have of myself is to make sure that everybody in an environment is getting along and enjoying each other's company. It really, I've been able to put words to that only in the last couple of weeks. That like I've taken responsibility onto myself for sometimes the way other people behave because I want everybody to get along. And I have this expectation on myself that I should be able to help people get along where they're not. Because I am a peacemaker by nature. And I think a lot of times I am able to help have conversations that get people to that place. But sometimes you cannot make people get along. Sometimes people don't want to get along. And when I have when I am trying to make people get along and they don't want to get along, I can't live up to that. I can't live up to that expectation. If somebody's not a willing participant in a harmonious environment, I cannot make them do that. And it only creates anxiety and frustration and irritation and annoyance in me, which then I can't be a good peacemaker or a good helper in any of those situations because I'm trying to make peace where people don't want to make peace. So to be able to just say, you know what, that's not my responsibility, fine, be that way. I need to be better at walking away from some of those things. But that's an expectation I put on myself. I have inserted myself in situations that I should have just minded my own business probably and not inserted myself in them because people weren't ready to get along. And I just maybe made it worse, and I certainly irritated myself in the process. So
I think that's well said.
Yeah.
How about you, Charles?
Yeah, I struggle with this question a little bit. This is something I'm working on that I think eventually, hopefully, at some point I'll get better at. But I have the assumption that I can get over things and forgetting wrongs that have happened to me quickly and easily. And I don't. I want to be able to do that. I'm working to be able to do that on a regular basis, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. I should be able to do that as someone in my position, as someone that has been given grace by God. It should be easy for me to do that, and sometimes it's just not. But I have the assumption and the expectation on myself that I should be able to do that, and I don't always do a very good job of that.
I think that's also well said. Yeah. I would answer this question. There are a couple things, and I'm going to probably just focus on one. I think I've felt like I'm not free to share my thoughts and feelings. And a big part of that is I have to be okay. Like if I'm not okay, there are people around me that fall apart. And that's just, whether that's true or not, that's something I've lived with for a long time. And so I have shoved down thoughts and feelings that eventually come out in some other way. And at times it's really hurt me, and it's hurt the relationships I've had. And I think some of that is the role I've had for years as a paid vocational pastoral Christian, professional Christian. And it's like, you do have people that like the idea of you, but they really don't like you. And so you can't, sometimes you do have to soldier on, and you have to just pull yourself together
For a moment.
You have to power through something, but then you do have to find, what I've learned is I have to find the space to be able to process my thoughts and feelings, because if I don't, they're going to come out, and they're going to hurt people, probably the people I love the most. So that's an assumption that I've lived with. And I still feel like sometimes if I'm not careful, I feel like I've thrown it off, but then I'll grab it back. And it's like, oh, it's Robot Brian again. And I'm like, I am a robot, and I don't want to do that. So what we just did was a very healthy practice of noticing and naming the anxiety within us. And it helps put us on the path to putting our anxiety in its proper place. Now, why is that? Because most of anxiety management is first paying attention to what is going on inside of us. Because the truth is, if we don't manage the anxiety within us, it will manage us. I think my example is probably pretty good because I've experienced it. However, when we notice, name, and put the anxiety or our anxiety in its proper place, then we can become more connected, aware, present, and instead of being managed by our anxiety, we can manage it. Now, moving to the next space, because we've talked about 4 spaces, there are 4 spaces, is we're going to move to space number 2. And space number 2 is a space between you and others. Between you and the other. So it's you and one other person. And this is where you either catch or you spread anxiety, or maybe a combination of both. And this often occurs because of a conversation or interaction. And the second space anxiety often evolves into predictable recurring patterns where you and the other play a recurring role. And this is often common between family members and close friends. This happens in relationships where it seems like every time people are faced with a challenging situation, they have the same or similar kind of fight. For example, what often happens in families where a parent gets a child up for school that does not want to get up and go to school? Probably some version or predictable recurring patterns of escalation that involve yelling, crying, threats, and other intense and unproductive communication. The key to managing this anxiety is to, again, notice and name it. So my question for everyone, and we have one question for this space, is this. Do you currently have, or have you had a situation where you experience predictable recurring patterns of anxiety? And I'm going to repeat it one more time because if you're watching or listening, I want you to be able to think about your life situation and the space between you and another. Do you currently have, or have you had a situation where you experience predictable recurring patterns of anxiety? And this time I want to start with Charles because I saw him smile.
Yeah. Well, it's because you wrote about it. So Parker getting out of bed in the morning, my 16-year-old son, is very difficult to get up most of the day, most of the time. And it causes me much anxiety because I am the type of person that's wired to want to be on time as much as I can control being on time, right? And him not getting out of bed is very, very stressful for me, and it causes me very much anxiety. So, and it has resulted in yelling, crying. Well, me not crying, him crying.
I wish it was you crying.
Not me crying. It has resulted in me being very frustrated and saying a lot of things. Yeah, a lot of things in my head that I shouldn't have been thinking or feeling. But that one, now recently I've learned that he hates water, so now I just start drizzling water on him and he gets up.
Oh my goodness.
Hey, look, it works. And now recently, I will tell you this past week, he had a serve on Wednesday morning. And it only took me twice. I went in and woke him up once, and then he never gets up the first time. I don't know that he's ever gotten up the first time ever. But the second time I walked back in his room, like, hey, you need to get up, and he actually got up. It was great, and it was a great morning. We had a good conversation on the way to the serve, and
you didn't have to get out your spray bottle.
I didn't have to get out. Well, I typically just get a glass of water that has ice in it, and I stick my finger in it and start dripping, dribbling on it. Hey, look, it works. It manages my anxiety, and it's kind of funny too.
Wow.
You never got to be a big brother, but it's kind of like your opportunity to be one.
Yep.
Brooke, how about you?
Well, I could use the example of the kids. I mean, asking them to do the chores they've agreed to do, it seems like it always turns into, no matter what, no matter if they're doing something or not. So I could use that example. But when we were talking about this, another thing that popped into my head was like from the gym, there are sometimes people that I have a level of anxiety approaching a situation because every time I try to help them with certain movements, it becomes a pout session because what I'm telling them to do, they don't want to do because either it's not fun or it's not sexy or it's not what they think they should be doing. And so I approach it knowing it's going to be the same pattern. Like in my head, I'm predicting that it's going to be the same. I'm approaching it with the mindset that I already know how it's going to go. I'm going to tell them what they need to do. They're not going to like it. They're going to huff at me. At some point, they're just going to completely ignore me. Things are not going to go well in the workout. And then that's going to be that. And nobody gets better, and I'm irritated. So I've never had an experience where there's been yelling and crying and escalation or anything like that. But I think if people were less mature, it absolutely could be that way, if that makes sense.
It does.
I think I'm not on a close enough personal level for that to be the reaction, you know. If it was my child, absolutely it would have gone to that level of expression. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say?
It does because of the familiarity.
Yeah.
It's easier to get more expressive.
Yeah.
Than maybe if you don't have that. For whatever reason, we have more restraint when it comes to people that we're not as close with.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. But that was an example outside of family that, to me, really fit the criteria of what you were talking about.
It's a good example. How about you, Vanessa?
I agree with what both of you have said. I can get a little anxious in circumstances like both of you mentioned. Mine also deals with Parker, but it's a little bit different. I have experienced an actual physical manifestation of his anxiety myself. When he was a baby and having to go to the doctor all the time, he would scream and cry bloody murder every time a blood pressure cuff was put on his arm. And it happened a lot when he was a baby. And there was nothing I could do. I just had to sit there and let him scream and cry. And of course that made his blood pressure go up, and they would often have to do it again. And before long, the next thing I knew, every time somebody put a blood pressure cuff on my arm, they would have to do it again. And I would have to say, look, I can take my own blood pressure at home, and I know it's fine, but this makes me anxious. And they would have to give me a few minutes, and then inevitably, you know, it's fine when they read it again. I think the last time the doctor took my blood pressure, it was fine the first time, but I had to kind of, you know, smell the flowers and blow out the candles a couple times before that cuff went on. And even now, Parker still gets very anxious when it's a medical procedure that he has not experienced before. Sometimes he has experienced them before, and it's really hard for me. It's hard for me to stay calm and either, you know, not lash out at him, just suck it up.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But try to be calm and at the same time empathetic, because it sucks, you know. It sucks for him. I don't want him to be in pain. I don't want him to have to go through any of that stuff, but when he works himself up to that point where they can't do anything, and then we have to go back, you know, that sucks too. So
Yeah.
yeah. So
That's also a very good example. When I was thinking about this, I thought about between us, that there's sometimes is anxiety produced when we have conversations about parenting our kids. And if you're listening, I pointed to Brooke, so you may not be watching this video, but that's who I'm married to. So, but when we manage our kids, we sometimes go about it from a different perspective. And it's when you have 4 that are different ages, different temperaments, different challenges, it's complex. And what one approach that works for another does not work for the next one, but it works for the next one, but it doesn't work for the next one, or a hybrid approach works. And so it's not a one size fits all. And depending on what's happening with us or how well we're communicating, speaking about Brooke and me, there can be sometimes tension and anxiety that I feel between us and internally on how we approach that. So we have to have ongoing conversations, and we've had one very recently, even out of a conversation that came from last week's small group church. What does it look like for me to put your needs before my own? And so I asked that question of Brooke, and then she asked that question of me, which led me to begin talking about making sure that we agree in front of the kids, unless someone is just doing something egregious,
Sure.
that's harmful, that we agree in front of the kids and we disagree privately. And because I'm fine to admit if I'm wrong, but when they smell disagreement or lack of unity between us, it's like a shark in blood, even though they're adults. So that was one of the conversations we had actually on Sunday. And even having that conversation created a little bit of anxiety in me, because you don't know how that's going to be received. But to Brooke's credit, she posed the question I had asked her originally. Her ask of me was much easier. It was like, hey, when I come to talk to you and you have your AirPods in, it would really be great if you would take them out. I was like, oh yeah, because a lot of times sometimes I'm like, I'm dumb because I won't even be listening to anything, but I've put them in for another reason, and I'm just walking around with them in my ears like a putz, and then she starts talking to me.
And he can't hear me, and I think I'm interrupting him, and he looks at me and he can't hear me, but I'm like, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. He's like, no, you're fine. And then he's shouting at me because he's got these things. I'm like, could you please just take those out of your ears? Like if you're not listening to anything.
But I didn't realize how much of a frustration that was for her until I asked that question coming out of last Sunday. Is and I just said, for this week, how can I put your needs before my own?
Yeah.
And that was very easy. When she turned the question around to me, I had 2 answers, and one of my answers was revolving around making sure when we have a hard conversation with one of our kids that we are functioning as a unit, and if there's disagreement that we have that conversation after, not in front of the kid.
Yep.
So to her credit, she received that really well. But I don't know about now.
Well, I think most parents probably go through that at some point. Most, not all, but some. I know we've gone through that same thing. Not to one up you, but
No.
I think.
Oh, I definitely took it that way.
Yeah.
Well, and
That's
I think
it's sarcastic.
I think that is I think that's a challenge for parenting just in general, because different seasons require different things. Different kids require different things. I think sometimes we're not aware how we're coming across in a moment, and the other person can see it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot to that. So I have anxiety around that as well from a different perspective, so it's a really good example, one
Yeah.
that I completely agree with. Good answer.
Yeah,
Pakistan is in the bag.
that's what I thought.
Oh, that's good. Blast from the past.
Well, that's a wrap for part 1 of podcast number 26. Thank you all for taking the time to listen in and learn how to become less annoying and how to better manage annoying people. Please follow us on social media, like and share the podcast. Also, stay tuned for part 2.